How's it going, YouTube? Coming in today with another video, and today, guys, the brand new is going to be the meta tier list for the new format. Now, I've been waiting to make this video because if a ban list came out tomorrow, it basically invalidates the meta tier list. So it is really frustrating that we haven't received a ban list yet and had no communication on it. So it can be a little bit hard for me to make videos around times when we're expecting a ban list, just because there's a lot of time and effort that goes into these videos. And if I post something that takes me like 5-6 hours to record and edit, and then the next day something comes out that just says, hey, like, this is old information now, it definitely can get, again, very frustrating. So I do hope that you enjoyed today's video. There's a lot of thought put into this, and it's really going to account for all the nationals that we've seen so far and a lot of the regionals. So if you haven't already checked out my sponsors over at Imperium Duels to Dragon Shield, Gem, or Sleeve Chief, definitely go ahead and do so, all down in the description below. And then also today, if you haven't already heard, over on Sleeve Chief, they have a huge drop for One Piece. Definitely go ahead and check them out. My affiliate code's down in the description below. And then also, my playmat is being sold on Imperium Duels. Please go ahead and check it out. And if you do pick one up, just know that you're directly supporting the channel, and I really appreciate it. Now, without further ado, let's hop right into the video. So today's tier list, we're going to be keeping YCS Philly in mind because I really want to make sure in such a broad format, like there's 22 decks here alone, that you really know which matchups you're going to be playing against a lot more later on in the tournament and which ones aren't going to be as popular after like round 4 or 5. And this is also going to be really important too, to really be able to narrow down a deck choice, right? When there's so many different decks, what do you play for the tournament? So hopefully today will give you some insight into that. I'm going to YCS Philly this weekend, so if you see me, feel free to come up and say hello. Always love meeting everyone. Now let's hop right into the tier list. So the first one I want to cover today is going to be Bestial Control. Amazing matchup against Mathmech and Branded. Not amazing versus Purely and Kashtira. So definitely something to think about. I think tier 2 is definitely safe for this deck, especially because it has a really good time against Rogue. But overall, I think Steel's Pass with hand traps is really strong. Do I think that it's going to be winning any tournaments? No. Do I think that it could top a tournament? Yes. And that's typically what decks will do in tier 2, is they probably won't win, but they'll top. And you could even put them to 1.5 if they have the potential to win, but then tier 1 is just going to be the decks that probably will win the event, right? So definitely interesting here, and we'll keep going on with Dino. I just wouldn't play this deck, honestly. If I was going to an event this weekend, and I just would not even think to choose Dino as my top 5. Even with the brand new cards, not having more than one miscellaneous source, and then also just having other decks like Kashtira, Purely, Branded that just have such a higher ceiling, I just really wouldn't even want to try to play Dino. I think that this is more of like a fun deck if you want to just bring it to like a local or side event. It's definitely cool, definitely fine, but I definitely wouldn't be bringing it out to a YCS. Talking about Fluenderies, though, this is definitely still going to be tier 2. I think this is really good for a lot of different reasons, especially because it has a really good matchup in a Super Heavy Samurai. Book of Moon is a crazy card, so is Empen, especially when your opponent doesn't have cards like Tactics or Book of Moon, so really, really cool. I think that overall we've seen a lot of Fluenderies in some of the top tables of the different national events, and I think that there's a lot of reasons for that. The deck has a built-in skill drain, has all the utility in the world. You have Harpy's Featherstorm, that card's insane, but the only thing that's really hurting right now is it's a hand trap format, and one of the hand traps is Droll. So Fluenderies, definitely taking an L to Droll most times, but at the same time, when Droll isn't there, the deck is going to have a really good time. Now, this is actually really hard for me to do, but I'm going to put Plunge Patrol and Rogue, because the only reason I'll put this here is that you have to be an amazing pilot with this deck to really be able to pull off some of the wins that you need to do really well in a tournament. I don't think this is going to be the optimal play for Philly. This is definitely a very strong deck and has a really good cash matchup because Yord put a token on their board, but at the same time, I just don't really know if this is a deck that will end up winning an event. I think that it has the opportunity to like sneak into top cut, but it's not going to be something that we will just openly see in top cut. So definitely something that is really strong, but requires a very good pilot. The next one here, Live Twin Sprite. I think Live Twin Sprite is such a phenomenal deck. This is something that has so many different ways to play. There's so many different engines that you can play in there too. We saw the Live Twin Runic Sprite even, but I think just Live Twin Sprite alone is good enough. I think that the Runic cards are suffering pretty bad right now, and we'll talk about why that is here in a little bit when we talk about Naturia. But overall, I think this deck just has a lot of utility, and the end boards that it can put up are pretty crazy. Some people went off of Dark Ruler already because of cards like Spell Canceller, so we already know that the cards like Dark Ruler aren't doing enough. So definitely really interesting to see how this deck will fare in the format. We have been seeing a lot of Live Twin Sprite in the top cuts too. Sprite did win a few nationals as well, so definitely can't count that engine out. Sprite is still one of the best engines we've ever had in the game. So if you're thinking about bringing Live Twin Sprite to an event right now, it's probably a pretty smart idea, to be honest. The next one here is going to be Striker. this has just got to be in Rogue. It's actually done really well on the regional level, but I don't know how well it's going to do in the YCS level. I do think that it's really cool that a deck like Striker can do wonders against decks like Super Heavy Samurai, just because it's another Wombo combo deck. So we never really cared about that playing this deck, right? That's what the deck is built to beat. It's really interesting too because there's so many different hand traps that you can play, and the original Striker builds were like 16 hand traps and a few spells, so definitely interested to see how this deck fares in the format. No, I don't think that it's the best deck right now, but at least in the Rogue category, where again, you have to just have a phenomenal pilot with this deck to really be able to put up numbers and show that you can do well with the deck. But overall, this deck is just Rogue right now. The next one though, Dark World, especially in a Droll format, this is something that I just wouldn't even attempt to play. This is something that just isn't that good. Everyone's on Ash right now for Genta, everyone's on Droll to go ahead and shut down the endless draws. There's just so many different reasons to just not play Dark World right now. I just really don't think that it has the best matchup into many different decks right now, including Kashtira. So if you were to play this, again, it would just be off to like a side event or like a locals, but I definitely wouldn't attempt to play this at like a larger event. Drytron, however, though, this is still going to be Rogue. You could put it in tier 2, even in a Droll format, just the ability to go for a huge Zeus and be able to put up a board and then have insane amounts of resources for the follow-up turn is still very strong. And then when you go first, being able to put up Vanity's Ruler or put up the Immore factor and have a turn skip too is really solid. So I think that overall Drytron has a really good time into the format. So this is something where it would still be in Rogue for me right now, but I could see at least one Drytron sneaking into top cut. But the next one I want to talk about is going to be Tri-Brigade Sprite. I think this is still Rogue too. It's a really cool option right now. I don't think that it's as strong as like the Live Twin Sprite build, just because of the fact that that build has a lot of different utility that you can utilize and a lot of different ways you can play through a board. But I do think that Tri-Brigade Sprite is really cool. A lot of different options that you can do in the deck. I've even thought about playing like just pure Tri-Brigade as like a local level thing, because Gamma's in the format, of course. You can play cards like Rescue Cat and really capitalize on Gamma. So a couple different things that you can do that I think are really cool. But overall, I think this deck just sits in Rogue for now. The next deck that I have for you today is going to be Sword Soul. Now, Sword Soul is definitely a very interesting one. I would probably put this at like a 2.5. I think this deck is really solid right now, but between 2 and Rogue, I really think that it's better than a lot of the Rogue decks in here, but it's worse than like some of the tier 2 decks in here. I'm probably still going to put it up here though, just because of the combos with Apple Dragon and whatnot, and just the fact that this deck can kill you out of nowhere, and then also play a lot of floodgates, and it has a lot of different ways that it can combo, and it's very consistent too. So I think this has a lot of potential this weekend, and we have seen it in quite a few national top cuts. So this is definitely something that you should at least think about going into the weekend, because you could play against one or two of these. Now, Rikas and Avalon, I would put this in Rogue. I understand this deck's a lot better than Rogue, at least like tier 2. But this is another one, again, it just falls under the same thing with Striker and Plunder, where you have to have a phenomenal pilot with this deck to do really well in a hand trap format, let alone, just because Ogre on Con is rough. Then if your opponent has like Ash for Sowing or Ash or Veiler for Jasmine, there's a lot of different ways this can go very wrong. So if you do plan on bringing this to the event, make sure that you know all your lines of play and the different ways you can play around different hand traps, because I feel like hand traps against this one in particular definitely does hurt. Plays a little bit better around Droll, which is definitely going to be nice, but Ogre, Ash, and Veiler are really tough for this deck to handle, so be prepared for that. I think Monodome just goes wherever Sword Soul is. They're effectively the same deck. Monodome does a little bit more, but I do think that Sword Soul is honestly a bit more consistent. But wherever Sword Soul is, I'm probably putting Monodome right next to it. I think Monodome has a lot of potential into the format. It's very cool, but I really don't know if it has enough to win an event, let alone top an event. And we haven't even really seen it in any of the top cuts in the Nationals for the most part. So I'm very interested to see if we see this deck in the top cut of YCS Philly. Now, it actually could be a surprise for the next one, but I think that Marincess is actually even tier 2 right now. This deck is really strong with a lot of the hand traps that it can play. I feel like a lot of different ways that you interact in the format with hand traps right now against some of these decks. Some of them definitely get hurt a lot more by a lot of hand traps than others. I think even Striker deals with hand traps a lot better than other decks. But I think that Marincess just has a lot of different ways that it can still play the game If you do get Nibiru'd, again, you still have cards like Coral Triangle for follow-up. You have a lot of different hand traps that you can play. I think it's even like 19, 20 slots in the deck that you can play hand traps. And then having cards like the Wave that you can just use out of your hand and protect your board, and then have that Imperm live. I think the deck overall just does a very good job into the hand trap formats where you really just are relying on seeing a one-card starter and a lot of recursion from the graveyard, because that's what this deck has, a lot of recursion. And we've seen it already in a lot of different events where the decks have performed really well out of nowhere. So I think that if you are looking for a rather cheap deck right now to do well with at the event, this is definitely going to be the deck for you. So tier elements is really interesting, and it's really funny that we even talk about it like this now because of the fact that the deck just isn't what it used to be. And I would definitely put this into Rogue. We have seen it in some of the national top cuts, but I just really don't think that the deck can perform that well right now. There's a lot of variables and way too much RNG for the deck, and there's different ways that you can mitigate that, but at the same time, you still have to mill well. So I just wouldn't really be confident, but I would still play this over something like Dino or Dark World. So I would still put this in a Rogue. The next one here is Labyrinth, and this is more of the IKEA build with all the furniture, and this would be right up at 1.5. I think this is a phenomenal deck right now. It's doing very well. I've played against it quite a few times, and let me tell you, this deck is tough once it gets rolling. So definitely something that you want to look out for. Definitely something that you want to look up before you go to the event and learn how to beat this. Ashe and Bell are very important for this matchup, so definitely make sure that you have Bell on your side, Ashe in your main, and that you are prepared for this matchup because you're probably going to play against it once or twice. This is getting a lot more prominent. It did very well in the national season. It took down 2 nationals, so definitely a really cool deck so far. The original just all trap build I didn't really love. I don't really like playing back row decks, but this plays a lot more mid-range, and I think that's really cool with a lot of recursion. And then you can also go drop D shifter and then chain the furniture out of your hand, which is also pretty crazy. That happened to me in one of my matches, and I just couldn't keep up, so definitely a very cool deck right now. Math Mech, I would say this is also up here at 1.5. This is a deck that just has the ability to just be so consistent and play a ton of hand traps. We just got the new Firewall Defensor, and that card is phenomenal. I like the card a lot. I didn't at first before testing, but now after testing, I think that it's really good. And Math Mech alone, again, super consistent end board. Being able to just put up Super Factorial and Heatzel is really strong alongside some hand traps, and then follow up plays with things like another Circular or Diameter. It's really crazy. So make sure that you're siding Bishels and Bell just so you don't lose to this matchup. The next one here is going to be Runic Naturia. I did say that we're going to come back to this deck. I would put this at tier 2. A lot of people are not expecting this deck right now, and if you know how to play the deck well, I think that it's going to catch a lot of people off guard. I think that Runic has a really hard time against all the different hand traps in the format. One being Droll, of course, that's going to be a really detrimental one. If you go normal summon Camilla, dump Tree, search, and get Drolled, definitely going to be a rough situation to be in. You can still draw on your opponent's turn though, which I really enjoy. It definitely puts you in a weird situation where you want to go for Fountain first as soon as possible and then start your plays, because at least even if you get Drolled, you have Fountain live. But as for Droll, it's affecting so many different decks right now, so it's really just pick your poison on what you want to use to go ahead and play around or play through Droll. And I think that Runic Naturia, again, is still one of those really insane sleeper picks right now that if you know the deck well, I think that it'll do you very well. And it honestly would be at the top of my tier 2s right now. Just because, again, the deck is suffering pretty bad right now with all the hand traps, but at the same time, the deck's still very good. So something to consider for the weekend. Now, as for Kashtira, I'm just going to put this up in tier 1. This is just the best deck of the format right now. There's just no way we didn't get a ban list for this deck just to get killed before YCS Philly. I think that it's kind of crazy because this was, I believe, 2% away from being tier 0 status in Brazil. Took down multiple nationals. And I think that if you want to do really well at an event, that you probably should just play Kashtira. But again, I'm not really going to talk much more about that. It's Kashtira. It is what it is. Hopefully soon we see a ban list and this deck just gets hit. Just kind of done seeing it, to be honest, but it is what it is. Pearly, I'm gonna put this at 1.5. I think that Pearly is really solid. Do I think that it's just, let alone one of the best decks of the format? No, I think that there's still a lot of issues and there's a lot of things we still have to figure out. Post the new set, when we get the card that you can target for Sleepy, yes, this deck will end up being up here. But for right now, I think this just stays at 1.5. It's still really strong, but I don't think that it's by far the strongest. I think that any one of these decks here could be just a fantastic choice for the weekend. Now for branded, I think this deck is so good. It's honestly the deck that I wanted to play for this weekend, but even I don't think that I had enough time with it. And this is something where I think that you have to really understand branded and have played it for a long time to do really well with it. But this is something where I do think this is going to be one of the strongest decks in the room. Sanctifier and Expulsion with Gimmick Puppet is really crazy. And this is something where the deck itself, yeah, you can lose to things like Ash, but there are other ways you can put up things like Cartesia and Quem. This deck overall is very strong, and even looking at the new support cards like Quem, I think it's really funny just because this card is probably the most broken card in the deck now besides Branded Fusion. If you didn't already know, Quem can bring back cards like Mirror Jade, and that's insane. So definitely a couple things that you have to know before the weekend about decks like Branded to really be prepared. But I do think that Branded is going to be one of the strongest decks in the room. The next one's going to be Gold Pride Punk. I would put this at tier 2. We've seen it do pretty well. This is something where if you really enjoy the Punk engine and you want to play something that's going to be a bit more combo centric, it can play a really interesting play style. Definitely going to be a deck that has the ability to contend. I wouldn't put Gold Pride Punk above Runic Naturia, but I would put it above quite a few of the decks here, just because I do think there's a lot of potential behind it, but I don't think that it's going to be like one of the craziest decks in the room, but we could see it in top cut. Now, as for Super Heavy, I am going to put this up in tier 1 as well. I think that this is something that is very strong. Even if you can't play spells and traps, Super Heavy does perform very well, and this is something where you can capitalize off of so many different situations where you can put up an entire board and then set up cards like Spell Canceller. And then in your sideboard, you have cards like the Fleur, where you can also go into your Orchid and be able to out cards like the 5 Rainbow. And then just to see people siding cards like 5 Rainbow still to really respect Super Heavy Samurai definitely warranted spot on the tier list here, because people definitely have this deck on their mind when they're going for tournament prep right now. So I think that Kashtira, Branded, Super Heavy are definitely going to be the biggest contenders in the room. But the next 4 here being Live Twin Sprite, the IKEA deck, Mathmech, and Purely are definitely going to be really solid options. Like if you really want to do well, any of these are going to be really solid for you. And then honestly, the Runic Naturia build, I think it is going to be almost tier 1.5. So the last one that I would consider as part of the top decks to really consider for the event. The other ones are all just going to be a question mark as if they will do well or top or do anything at the event. But I think anything Naturia Runic and above are just really fantastic options for the event. Definitely let me know what you think down in the comments below. I'm definitely interested to hear what you have to say. I really like the way that the format is going right now, but I do wish that there was a ban list on things like Gimmick Puppet and Diabolosis just to make the gameplay a little better. But we'll have to see how things play out YCS Philly, and I hope to see you there. Thank you.